Hello, this is Sahidi Bonalapati. I'm brand development here at Personal AI, and today we're here with Susan. Susan, how do you say your last name? Is it Coach?
Coach. Yeah. It's a German name and it actually means cook in German. And there's many ways to say it, but the Blackfoot pronounce it as coach. So because I live in Blackfoot territory, we're going with coach.
Wonderful. Okay. Nice to officially get to meet you. I know you've been very active on Twitter, and I love all of the initiatives that you've been working on, and your communication is always delivering so much value to your community, and you're always engaging with personal AI customers as well. So, really excited to have you here today. I know
Thank
you mentioned, yeah, wonderful to have you. I know you mentioned a lot of different initiatives that you work on and kind of the communities that you're working for and to protect and give a voice to. Could you give us maybe a little bit more of a background into how you got into the current work that you're doing and the communities that you're working with?
Sure. So my background goes back to the visual arts. So I call myself a conceptual artist, a social entrepreneur, and a social information architect. But it all began by studying the visual arts, desire to be initially to become an animator from a young age, which meant that I had to study painting and drawing. And then as time went by, obviously digital stuff came into the picture. And by the time I went to art school, it was all about digital. So, and that actually sped up the process of learning how to be an animator. So the efficiency was there from the beginning. And then obviously, I mean, I just fell in love with the technology. And then it just continued, and I just kind of rode every wave every time there was something new, whether it was image processing, word processing, content management systems, whatever the new thing was, I was always trying it out and experimenting with it, and got into web design and development, with the content management systems and Joomla and WordPress and Wix and so on. And then social media came up, and I really love social media because I studied media. I studied Marshall McLuhan is a famous media guru out of Canada, coined the phrase "the medium is the message," and the other important concepts about media. So social media really resonated with me because of that social aspect is so important, particularly when it comes to the old media, which was mass media, which is like a one-way thing and you couldn't interact with it. So the idea that it's social, that it's personal, it touches on the personal AI and so on. So now as we continue these waves, of course, the big new thing is AI. So I've been working on this project for 5 years, the Two Row Flow Cultural Commons, trying to figure out how to resolve a social problem with interacting between two groups, which are highly separated due to government and policy and so on and so forth. And it just seems like the AI as a mediator was a concept that really intrigued me. So yeah, that's how I got to this particular spot. And the information architecture part is, when I was doing the web design and development, it came up that my clients weren't sure. They didn't want me to do their social media because actually I moved from Toronto back to Alberta, and they're a little bit behind Toronto. As you know, the East Coast is always ahead of the West. I sort of moved back into the rural areas, and they were saying, oh, we don't understand this social media. We can't wrap our heads around it, but something's wrong with our website. And so I dove into that because I'd already been tracking information architecture for many years, having read a book by Richard Saul Wurman on what it was to be an information architect. But then it involved going to university and getting either computer science, library science, computer behavior studies at very high level. And I couldn't afford to do that as a single mother. So I was just tracking, how do I get into that space? And then I figured it out that it's under the user experience umbrella. If you're familiar with user experience and UX design, it encompasses all, including marketing and information architecture. So that's the structure of your website, basically based on words, categories, your navigation, your whole design of the information of the website is what, at the end of the day, is going to inform your users. So yeah, once I got my UX design certification and in research and UX design, I focused on information architecture. So I needed a project. So the two-row flow cultural commons kind of worked well with some personal activism that I was doing around things that were happening in Canada about 10 years ago, and the opportunity to actually do something to, create a project as a settler in Canada that kind of contributed to, well, now we call it peacemaking. But at that time, I wasn't sure what or how or anything. I just started down this path of creating a big idea. Again, I love concepts. The big idea was a commons. And the idea of the commons comes from the European tradition, where they actually, until the monarchies came in and took everyone off their land, people had a shared commons, like they had a forest. And my German ancestors from Bavaria actually lived in the Black Forest in Europe. So actually have that in my roots as well. So that was the idea of creating this commons. It had to be about culture, because we weren't talking about resources. It wasn't like we were sharing the water or sharing, the minerals or the oil and gas. The culture was the thing that we have to share. We have different cultures. And then when I started to explore that, it turns out that treaties were made, particularly the two-row wampum, which is, the name of the two-row flow cultural commons. Actually, the chiefs spoke to the Europeans and said, what we need to do to achieve peace and understanding or overstanding is to understand each other's ways and customs and laws. We need to know that. So it was actually baked into the original treaty that we should have an understanding of one another's culture. That's a good thing. That's how you achieve peace, right? So then I was like, okay, let's make this commons about various aspects of these two different cultures. Of course, elevating First Peoples cultures, because they have been overlooked, dismissed, ignored, whereas the settler culture is always, pretty much in your face. So yeah, one thing led to another, and that's why we're here today talking about personal AI, because I feel that it's a great mediator, an artificial intelligence mediator between those two sides. So thank you.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. And it sounds like, we're always having to evolve the skill sets we possess, and our understanding of the world around us kind of evolves with those skill sets. So it's great to hear how you've taken the initiative to go seek out the latest technologies and the latest ways to connect and communicate with people. Personally, I is also very much about that personal brand and cultural awareness, and being able to communicate our individual cultures and those that we stand up for and support with others. So I would love to hear a little bit more about the two communities that you've referenced. I mean, the first, maybe a little bit more of a background on the First People, and kind of a little bit about their culture and how communication is helping them, and how we're facilitating mediation.
Sure. So again, the focus of the commons is on, I did some UX studies to begin with settlers to try to find out where they were at with respect to how much they knew about First Peoples. And to clarify that, when we say First Peoples, we're talking about in Canada alone, there's over 600 different nations. And in America, I believe there's about 570. So these are all unique, some people call them tribes, some people call them bands, nations, sovereign nations. There's various levels of, terms that are used to define, but they all have unique cultures. But they also an overarching kind of worldview. So it's that worldview that's so important. That worldview is dramatically different than the European worldview. And for the most other cultures now too, including, Asia, Africa, because most of all of these other cultures in India have been colonized, whether we like it or not. The Europeans, did this big colonization, which affected probably every nation on the planet. And so even though there are indigenous cultures in every nation, Canada and America are unique, and Australia, with respect to actually having the foresight to create these treaties, these agreements. And the treaties were made between the chiefs who represented their peoples on their particular territories, and the European representatives for the monarchy, whether it was the British or the Spanish or the French monarchs. So they signed these treaties. But again, the worldview was different because the Europeans did have paper and parchment, whereas the indigenous peoples had oral traditions. So already you see the two different worldviews dramatically, not even understanding each other's, because one wants to write it down, where we see the media, which is Marshall McLuhan talks about print media extensively, as opposed to the oral tradition where it wasn't written down, it was passed down. The knowledge was, they had knowledge keepers who passed it on. It was sacred, it was protected, whereas ours is a piece of paper. So you already see the split right there with the misunderstanding from the very beginning, because the Europeans are basically after land and resources, whereas indigenous chiefs were truly after understanding and peace. With respect to the two-row flow or the two-row wampum, for which the two-row flow commons is named after, that was an agreement that came out of peace, a peace treaty that had existed in North America with the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee peoples, the Mohawk peoples on the East Coast, since the 12th century. So since the 12th century, they recognized how important it was to keep the peace. And then these Europeans came and, they extended this, okay, let's continue to keep the peace. We need to understand each other's ways. And so what, and customs and laws. So what's happened is that there is no understanding of each other's ways and customs and laws, other than the fact that the European tradition has been forced on indigenous peoples. They were even forced to go to residential schools and learn the European ways. But for settlers, because of the policy of apartheid, which is really literally one of separation, keeping these two groups separated, indigenous knowledge of indigenous cultures in America is very, very low. In Canada, it's a little bit higher. For some reason, we have a more socialistic view as opposed to really capitalist view of the world. So we're a little more open to understanding other cultures and not just riding that capitalist wave for all that it's worth. So yeah, the education part is, within the last, I think it's with the last 10, 20 years in Canada, we've had something called Truth and Reconciliation, which they had in South Africa. I don't know if you followed, the apartheid system in South Africa, but they also had at the end of the fall of apartheid, a Truth and Reconciliation. So we started that process as well. But the truth is, if you look through those 94 agreements on calls to action, none of them are addressed to the individual. They're all institutions which are underneath the government, which is great, but they're universities, mostly, all the different departments and so on, which is fine. But the thing is, this is the governance model that created the problem in the first place. And what about the individual commoners or the individual citizens, or however you want to describe the settlers and the immigrants who live on these lands? What is their role? So that was another reason for starting this. So how can settlers self-educate? For the most part, most people aren't going to take a course at university. They're very separated from what they call the reserves, or even in the cities, you have indigenous peoples, but for the most part, they're living in pretty dire conditions, again, separated from the average working class settler. So how are we going to self-educate? So obviously there is a lot of information. It's out there. Twitter is a great source. Especially I started following thought leaders on Twitter, indigenous thought leaders, seeing what they're sharing, what's going on, what are the current issues. And then from that, there's a lot of information. So then how do you process it? How does the settler process it? What are the questions? What are the things they want to know? What do they need to know? So this just continued to evolve to the point now where I believe that this personal AI has the ability to have First Peoples actually train their own AIs as to their own stories for their own purpose, but over and above that, the ability to share some of that information, whatever they choose to share, with the settlers in a way that is informative and educational. And the settlers can then interact with that personal AI. And then the first person or the indigenous person can choose whether or not they want to continue that conversation, maybe directly, or just continue to use their AI to continue to inform, because for the most part, most Indigenous peoples just repeat themselves over and over. This should be basic knowledge. You should know this by now. They're constantly getting frustrated. But the truth is, again, most settlers are, where do we get this information? You know, it's not on TV. It's not in the mainstream media. You know, it's rather obscure. I mean, if you look for it, it's there. But the idea of creating a commons where that information is there and allowing settlers to engage with it and basically upgrade their consciousness as to what's going on with First Peoples, so we can do what we were meant to do as treaty people, because we are considered treaty people. Anyone who lives in any one of these territories, there's 8 treaties in Canada, are under those treaties, and they should be honoring those treaties, but for the most part, they're just forgotten, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so.
Wow. Yeah, I think everybody who watches this will be learning a lot today. So thank you for educating us all. So I would love to hear a little bit about, are there existing Indigenous or treaty people and communities that you've maybe introduced to personal AI, or settlers that you've introduced to personal AI, or maybe even examples of your own collection of stories and their narratives that you've pushed to your personal AI that have kind of helped consolidate information? Or how do you see that information kind of playing out as it flows in and out of your personal AI?
Well, that's a great question. I think there's different ways that I can use my personal AI. For example, when it comes to, you know, the actual marketing of it, how am I going to actually engage with First Peoples and get them to start using the personal AI? So I'm hoping to do it through text messages, because, you know, mobile phones are really dominant, as opposed to, you know, everyone on the planet pretty much has a mobile phone, where laptops and so on is not quite the same thing. So that's the method. And then I'm thinking to use my own, one of my own personal AIs as the responder to those texts, and, you know, any kind of conversations or questions, frequently asked questions, that'll be all within that particular personal AI. And back to the actual commons, or the AI.net, which will facilitate conversations between the settlers and First People, that I see the First Peoples or the Indigenous peoples who choose to participate training their own AI. So they'll dual purpose. Obviously, they can train for their own stories and their own personal life or business or whatever. But at the same time, the hope is that they'll share some of the information to maybe another AI that they set up, you know, a Peacemaker AI, so that settlers, questions that settlers ask, or if they just want to share it out into somehow into a lounge, I guess, at this point. So we'll be setting up some sort of a lounge. So that information will be there on a daily basis. And if there's enough First Peoples contributing, that there'll be like a lot of information, you know, so settlers can come in and pick and choose who they want to engage with. Maybe they'll go into a private lounge with that particular AI belonging to that particular Indigenous person and continue the conversation and learn more. Yeah, so that's sort of how I see it right now. At this point, I've only reached out to one First Nations man, Indigenous man, his portrait is shown here. If you go to the website, Alfred, and he is a Mohawk philosopher and author and educator, political strategist. So he has agreed to put up his profile first. So it'll be profiles for settlers and profiles for First Peoples. So that'll allow you to see who they are, where they're coming from, you know, what their lineages or their ancestors are, you know, sort of what they maybe do in their full-time occupation, what their philosophy is, and so on and so forth. So those profiles will be there. And yeah, so I'll be starting to try to engage First Peoples to actually get their own personal AI. So, you know, that hasn't started yet, but that's the plan.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I will be very excited for the day that we have a whole community of First People being able to advocate and tell their stories, and us being able to share those stories with larger communities and get their voices out. in front of more people. So it's really wonderful to hear the beginning of the movement kind of being ignited. Yeah.
Yeah, because it is worldwide. I mean, First Peoples, Indigenous peoples know that, well, they're sovereign nations. They should be operating at the international level, right? It's only because of the structure of the existing, political system that they're not. They're not recognized as sovereign nations, even the United Nations. So they constantly go up one level to international relations, because they do have, these treaties are held with the crown. So in Canada, the treaties are held with the British Crown. They're not held with the Canadian government. The Canadian government just happens to be a colony of the British Crown. So First Peoples are always referring to, the European, the Crown, and international relations. So yeah, I'm looking forward to, I know the personal AI is international. So getting
Yeah.
the word, yeah.
Or the real champion for leading it and kind of being able to be the first to really introduce it to so many communities that could benefit from it. So one thing I'm curious is, how did you find out about personal AI? Was it kind of in your research of tools?
Great question. Great question. A great story. So I love to listen to podcasts. I'm a podcast, like always listen. Every day I listen to a few podcasts and different topics. So I like a whole smorgasbord, but I have particular topic. I was listening to AI information because, it's just stormed everything for the last 2 or 3 months. And I was listening to a podcast called, I think it's called Technically Human, in which a woman was doing an AI podcast with an AI Indigenous media lab in Montreal. And she was speaking to, one of the founder or the head of the lab. And he was talking about the Indigenous or the Indigenous perspective on artificial intelligence from his, media lab and the students he was working with. He's based, I think he's from Hawaii, and he's married to a Mohawk woman. He's Indigenous to Hawaii, and he's married to a Mohawk woman out of Montreal, who I had approached years ago about collaborating, and she had kind of, I don't know, whatever, she was busy, and never materialized. But then I heard this podcast and I did my research, and I was like, wow, I saw the links. That was his partner. And then what I was interested in was the Indigenous perspective on artificial intelligence, was that it's kin. So kin as in family, as in we need to have a relationship with artificial intelligence. So while most people are going off on the big fear mongering and how it's going to take over the world and enslave humanity and yada, yada, this particular group is saying, hey, it's intelligence. We have relationships with all aspects of nature, the winged ones, the four-legged, the two-legged, the rocks, the stones, the sky, the moon, the stars. Indigenous people have relationship is key. And all of these relationships are essential to their worldview. So inviting in an artificial intelligence is not, is part of what you would expect if you understand that worldview. So I was like, wow, this is really cool. And then about a week later, the next podcast on that same Technically Human came up, and it was about personal AI and power to the people. And I was like, wow, and I started to listen. And then I was like, wow, if I could connect personal AI with this idea that artificial intelligence is kin for Indigenous peoples, just seems like a no-brainer. And so one thing led to another, and that's where we are right now.
That's wonderful. I didn't know that that's how you found us. It's almost like it was meant to be, because just at the time, yeah, exploring AI tools, and then the next episode being the personal AI tool that you're currently utilizing that's great to hear. I'm so glad. So I would love to know, and maybe listeners would also benefit from being able to hear an example of directly maybe one piece of content or a story from the communities you represented that maybe you fed your AI, or what's one
Yeah,
method maybe?
sure. So most recently, my daughter got married in Toronto
Mhm.
to an Australian man.
Oh,
and a settler, and I was asked to do a toast. So I used my personal AI for this, and I'm very proud of what I created because initially I was going off on various tangents and I was given some constraints to work within. So based on those constraints, I had a conversation with my own personal AI and said, I really need to come up with this. I was also given a time constraint of initially it was 4 minutes and then it went down to 3 minutes. And then at the end, it could have been, I guess, 5, but I kind of try to keep it within the 3 minutes. So I told my AI, these are the constraints I have. I want to present at the wedding and so on. Any suggestions? So my AI came up with some suggestions, particularly one around choices, love and marriage, which I really liked. And then I sort of took off, elaborated on that whole choices, how important it is, all the choices you've made up until this time have led you to this particular place to be at this wedding, thanking all of the different people who had traveled from Australia, the parents and the friends and so on. But in addition to that, when I talked briefly about marriage, it reminded me of a Mohawk friend of mine, a girlfriend had said that treaties are like a marriage. And she'd really stressed that. And it was like, that's how serious they were about treaties. We're not just talking about a piece of paper. We're talking about a real, the core, one of the fundamental relationships you have in life, which is a marriage. So when I spoke at the wedding, I said, if treaties are like a marriage, then marriage is like a treaty. So based on that, we have to basically consider the fact that First Peoples, the way they treated treaties were as living things. They were something, they had to be revisited on a yearly basis. So, I spoke about the fact that in a perfect world, we could gather every year as you would with Indigenous peoples and treaties, and they had treaties with their own tribes and nations before settlers came, and they would gather together on a yearly basis and revisit the treaty and the terms and the conditions. So I said, in an ideal world, we would all gather together, maybe in Canada or Australia or whatever, but it's not an ideal world. So we will leave it up to the couple to do the revisiting of their terms and conditions in the spirit in which this was made, right? So anyhow, if you want to see the whole talk, the toast, I put it up on this website, peacemaker.ai. If you go to my profile, settler profile, on this side, my face there, and you go just under there, you'll see it's called a statement of remorse, which would be a statement about what has happened with the genocide of First Peoples, but I haven't created that yet. So I just put that video there with respect to the toast, because it does again apply to relationship, particularly the relationship or the notion of relationship as it applies to treaty in Canada and the United States.
that is beautiful. I love every second of that. I'm very excited to watch this. I really,
Very personal, but at the same time, baked into the fact that this is a land, this is a lands that we live on. This is a lands in which this marriage has taken place, and we need to honor the peoples whose lands that we live on, right? So
absolutely. And it's so admirable of you to be willing to share such a personal toast on the same platform that you're working towards all these larger initiatives, because it goes to show that really all of our efforts are connected in life, right? And especially when it comes to a ceremony as valued and as special as a marriage, and being able to value the land it's taking place on. It's a beautiful intersection, I think, of all the efforts that you're working on. So this is wonderful to see. I'm very excited to watch this, and I hope our listeners too. Yeah, I would I think that's a great note for us to wrap on, but I would love to leave the floor open for any final remarks you might have, or any advice maybe you have for anybody looking to utilize AI or any tools in general, but maybe particularly personal AI, on getting their story heard or getting their cause more visibility, or being able to represent their community or strengthen their community that they're advocating for. Is there any advice or any final remarks you might have?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I do have a couple of remarks on the personal level. you know, obviously, like I said, I looked at the documentation, I went into the lounge, I heard about the tips and tricks, but you know, there's all these things that you should do and you could do, and you know, I tried to get my Twitter connected. I'm still working on that through Zapier, but I kind of taking it, you know, obviously should be giving it tons of information about your life and your, you know, what you've been doing and your, but I was kind of taking it, just jumping into where I am in my life right now and how I could use it to support me. And the example of the toast is a perfect one, right? So, but it worked out really nice. And then on the professional level, I think with personal AI and working on projects themselves, like the great benefit of the two-row flow cultural commons has been, like, if you're familiar with developers, in particular at Google and places like that, they tell them to do a 20% time and work on a project other than, you know, their own, like their business or whatever their role is as an employee. So it's been incredibly beneficial, because if you work on it and give it enough time and energy, the thing continues to evolve. And the beauty is you actually really do build something, but you need consistency and you need time and you need energy. It doesn't have to be like all the time. But you need to touch it pretty much on a daily basis, like an hour or two every day, in order to actually, you know, keep up with where you're at with that. So yeah, there's an equation that goes, time factored by energy equals art. So again, going back to my original, you know, calling as an artist, I think it's really apropos that, you know, if you take the time and you put the energy out there, what you will create is basically something that is artful, or basically the role of the artist is to update consciousness. That's the McLuhan definition of art, is not craft, but updating of consciousness. So really that's what this Peacemaker AI.net is all about, and the commons, is try to update the consciousness of settlers so they really understand what's going on with First Peoples and their issues and so on. Mhm.
That is,
Thank you, Sahidi, for
ah,
taking time to interview me. I really appreciate it.
of course, no problem, Susan. I've loved getting to speak with you, and so many great bits of information there that I will definitely remember forever. Can you state that formula for us one more time?
Sure. So the formula is time. So the letter T, and then factored by energy. So you have your round brackets, equals A, which equals art. So time factored by energy equals art. So just apply yourself, give it the energy, give it the time, and you will create something. It's inevitable, right? Just stick to it.
It's been lovely getting to speak with you, Susan. Thank you so much for your time. And I very much look forward to keeping up with your personal AI and any help that you need along the way to launching to more of the community and getting the initiatives off the ground and lands protected and back to the original kind of source of information and truth, and being able to communicate it in a way that resonates with everyone around the world. So thank you so much for sharing with us. I'll look forward
Thank
to
you.